Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar about adopting the Surveillance Camera Code of Practice. Before I start, I just wanted to thank the British Banking Association for promoting this to their members, and of course the members for listening into it. I'll speak to about 25 minutes, and I will outline the nature and role of the Codes of Practice and what I do to oversee them. But let me start at the beginning and the background to CCTV. Many of us will know that TV first came into our public consciousness in 1936, and it's just about a decade later an innovative police superintendent decided he'd like to use the live footage to start looking at operational deployment of police officers. This is the first thinking around how CCTV might be used. 10 years later, in the 50s, police forces began to use CCTV, assisting in traffic operations, etc. And by the end of the 1960s, there was 14 different forces across the UK using approximately 67 cameras nationally, so it wasn't really a big deal. But during the next 2 decades, CCTV became fairly routine, but it was really an iconic event, and that was the abduction and murder of Jamie Bulger in 1933 that brought CCTV to the public consciousness. Many of you will recall the grainy images of Jamie Bulger being led away from a Merseyside shopping centre by his 2 10-year-old killers. And as I've said, they became iconic. Now, it was really this single incident that led to a huge funding of public space surveillance camera systems by both central and local government. And between 1995 and 98, it's estimated that 85 million funding was secured. And then in 1999, a further 153 million was set aside to support CCTV. And by the end of that year, CCTV market was 361 million annually. So you can see the size and scale of CCTV, and it's really only overgrown bigger and bigger. And it has become part of the British psyche. And it still is, very much depending on which estimates you look at. There are between 2 and 6 million cameras in the United Kingdom. And it's been said that in any urban area on a busy day, a person could have their image captured by around 300 cameras on 30 different systems. So from humble beginnings, it has become a cottage industry. There's no doubt about that. So, really, that takes me to my role, Surveillance Camera Commissioner. Protection of Freedoms Act was introduced in 2012 and paved the way for my role, and I was appointed last year by the Home Secretary, but I am independent from government. The role was created to ensure that surveillance camera systems are used to support and protect communities, not spy on them. And to help with this, the Home Office published the Surveillance Camera Code of Practice in June 2013. Now, that Code of Practice contains 12 guiding principles. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I just thought it'd be helpful to talk about my background. I started back as a bobby on the beat in Stockport, Greater Manchester in 1982, finishing just over 30 years later as a commander at New Scotland Yard with responsibility for national counter-terrorism investigations for the 2012 London Olympics. When I left the police, I went to work with Barclays, running UK and European physical intelligence. And it was there that I saw the volume of CCTV cameras and the valid contribution it made to the physical security of the network, and was able to compare and contrast the private and the public industry of CCTV and how respective organisations use it. So I have had first-hand experience of how technology is used. I do understand how cameras protect your staff and your customers, how they do aid security, and how they can be used in crime prevention, detection, and resolution. So, surveillance in banks. Often seen as the most secure places in the world, and a large degree of responsibility is down to you people. In banks, you know CCTV sweep perimeters, cover ATMs, look at reception areas, they care for your staff, they identify illegal activity at banking facilities. They are there to protect customers, staff and assets. They can help prevent robberies, and many of you will have been involved in the recent investigations into the ATM gas attacks that came to successful conclusion last year, when it was the combined efforts of CCTV across your respective banks that helped to bring those organised crime groups to buck. So a well thought out and designed CCTV system can be an excellent weapon in the armoury of any bank to deter, investigate and resolve crime. But at the same time, there are privacy issues to consider. With high-profile media stories such as Snowden, facial recognition and smart TVs that record conversations, surveillance is very much in the public mind. So while CCTV can be the silent guardian that protects your banks, it cannot be at the price of the person's right to privacy. So as I just mentioned, the Surveillance Camera Code of Practice was published by the Home Office 2 years ago. Relevant authorities, now they're police crime commissioners and local authorities, they must pay due regard to the code. They have a legal obligation. But for everyone else, adoption is voluntarily. So for banks, adoption is voluntarily. But you do hold a unique position. And the banking sector has come up under public scrutiny and criticism for a number of issues, the LIBOR, PPI, mortgage mis-selling. And I know that the issue of ethics and transparency is one being pushed by many bank chief executives. So the code of practice enables the public and communities to hold users of surveillance camera systems to account, to make sure they're being used for intended purposes and they don't impinge on an individual's right to privacy. And it can be summed up quite succinctly in the term surveillance by consent. So maintaining public confidence in the people your cameras are protecting is an incentive on its own for complying with the code. It can wane very quickly if people begin to think they're being looked at rather than looked after. And what a powerful argument for your chief executives, given that this is born out of transparency, it's born out of the Protection of Freedom Code, to make an argument to voluntarily adopt the code of practice. My role is to encourage compliance with the code, review its operation, and advise on any amendments as to how the code should be developed. As I said earlier, there's 12 principles. Effectively, principles 1 to 4 address the issues around the specified purpose of the camera. They seek to ensure that regular reviews to ensure the use is still justified is made. They encourage you to identify published points of contact because people like to know who they can contact. And they also demonstrate and seek to urge responsibility and accountability for those systems. Principles 5 to 12. Much like good governance arrangements, it's good practice to have rules, policies and procedures in place regarding the operation of your system. It's useful to have these written down somewhere and available for staff to reference. They should form part of an induction for any new staff members. And the public could also be made aware of your policies to give them reassurance that cameras are being used appropriately. So I've talked around the principles relating to installation and governance. Now I'll look at principles that cover image capture and retention. Some falls within the domain of the Information Commissioner. I have a very close relationship with the Information Commissioner, and we have an MOU that identifies the nature of how we work with each other. It goes without saying that you shouldn't store images on your system for longer than is necessary, whilst there's no set retention period, as it may vary from system to system. But for most CCTV, the systems I see automatically delete data after 31 days unless it's been pulled out for use as evidence. For body-worn video, for ANPR, it might be different. It might be different reasons and causes that require a different retention period. It's up for you to satisfy yourself that your retention of data is proportionate and deleted when no longer necessary. Access and disclosure of images and data is also incredibly important. Who is able to access the images your system records? Does your system record an audit trail of who has reviewed or downloaded footage? Also, what is your policy for allowing access to data to law enforcement agencies or others? Have you got one? You may want to download a specific segment of footage for a police investigation, but is it proportionate to download days of footage? Generally, clearly, it's not. Pixelation and privacy by design. Can you mask out individuals to protect their privacy? Individuals can make a subject access request to view footage that they are in perhaps following an accident, but the system operator has the discretion to refuse access to information unless there is an overriding legal obligation. Let me now talk about standards, which Principle 8 relates to. I'm determined to raise standards across the industry. I recognise that they're voluntary, most British standards, but in adopting a standard, it raises you above others in your sector. I recognise the current standards framework is complex, even mysterious. Now, I have a standards group in place working on simplifying the standards framework to demystify it. I completely get that if you're looking for information on standards, it can be bewildering. To help, I've published a list of those relevant standards on my website. Security is also paramount importance, particularly for a bank. You need a system that in place is secure so no one can compromise it, or the data that is stored. How do you make sure only authorised people can use the system? Is it password protected? Can you see who's accessed the system and when? If you're using wireless networks, what do you have in place to maintain the integrity of the connection to ensure it can't be lost or hacked? And actually, do you evaluate the performance of your system to make sure it's still effective? I've heard stories of a camera put in winter, but by the summer it's useless, and its view is now obscured by a tree. I know how banks work. I know that every pound is important to spend effectively. If your systems are defunct or out of date, I know that your senior leaders will be delighted that the review is removing cameras but maintaining security where appropriate. So systems should be reviewed regularly, at least annually. This is to make sure that cameras and systems remain necessary and justified. It will ensure that the system's being used for its intended purpose, as well as help you see if you can decommission, as mentioned. Does your system support law enforcement and provide data that is of evidential value? Well, we saw in the ATM gas attacks that those systems did, but do all the cameras within the system have the same quality? Are they all capable of being uploaded to the law enforcement agencies? Or is it difficult? Does it take law enforcement time and your staff time? These are things that need to be focused on to come more into line with the guiding principles within my code. And finally, on principles, we're seeing technology advance at the speed of light. Facial recognition is now more prevalent. Some of you may already be using it in access control, perhaps. This technology matches images against a reference database looking for matches. It's used in casinos to identify high-worth customers. The FBI use it, and actually the UK Leicester Police Force are trying it. I mention it as these databases must be kept up to date and regularly assessed. If you use this technology, who is checking your databases? Is it regularly reviewed? Is it compliant? So, why adopt the code? I've already mentioned LIBOR, PPI, Forex trades, the difficulties the banking sector have faced over the last years. The public are looking at banks. Banks are adding ethics to their strategy. This is the time where I believe people in the physical security business and data protection management business can be making the case to their leaders to voluntarily adopt the code. But you may be thinking to yourself, well, there's quite a lot of things I need to comply with. There are, but if it's done systematically, if it's done through a process of good governance, if you use the self-assessment tool that I've advertised on my website, that can help you guide through to make sure your systems are running effectively and efficiently. In relation to that self-assessment tool, that will help you look that you have fully adopted the code. But more importantly, it will help you develop action plans where perhaps you're somewhat lacking. Now, I don't want to see your respective self-assessment tools completed. I only have a small team and I wouldn't have the capability to do it. But this tool has been worked by my team together with the SSAIB and NSI, two accrediting bodies, and thoroughly tested with the CCTV managers and operators. It really does work, and it couldn't be simpler for people to download and utilize and then show to their bosses that we are compliant or otherwise with the surveillance camera code of practice, and that you're now capable of putting a plan in place to align to that code of practice. I would urge you to download that tool, and if you're successful in doing that, why not advertise that on your website to demonstrate to the public the transparency of your bank. So what next? Complete the tool, and if you comply with the code, publicize it. It's a move in the right direction, and it also mirrors and chimes with the other organisations, the relevant authorities, the police, local authorities, Transport for London, universities that are also moving towards adopting the code. And it would be lovely to see the banks at the forefront, at the vanguard of that initiative. You can see my contact details. Please feel free to jot them down, follow me on Twitter, download the self-assessment tool on the website. That is broadly all I've wanted to say. But before I sign off, reiterate again my thanks to the BBA for aligning you people, you're all busy, to this webinar. At the last webinar that we were unable to fully complete owing to a technologically difficult situation, there were a couple of questions that were advanced, and I thought it would be appropriate just to raise those as I conclude the webinar. I had one question saying, why do you and the ICO have two separate codes of practice? It's confusing. Well, yes, I can see that. But as I've said, I work very closely with the Information Commissioner. And the Information Commissioner's Code has recently been rewritten so that it follows what is in the Surveillance Camera Code. It complements rather than duplicates. So if you follow one, you should, in theory, be well on the way to complying with the other. There was another question that the questioner said, you said only councils and police forces must pay due regard. What are you doing about other sectors? Well, that's right. I'm pleased to hear that you listened. You're absolutely spot on. The majority of cameras are, however, owned by non-relevant authorities. So we're talking universities, retail, housing, leisure. And we are developing a strategy to engage with all of those sectors. I have issued the self-assessment tool for all sectors. There are clear benefits, and in relation to the banking sector, I believe I've outlined them. But my direction of travel is to advise ministers this autumn as to how the code should move forward. And at the moment, I'm actively looking at whether it needs to be expanded. Does that include all public space surveillance? Does it include all organisations with a number of cameras in their system of a certain number? Well, the consultation period isn't over, but I would say at this stage, why not get ahead of the curve and become compliant with the code? I'd like to say thank you once more. Thank you for listening. Please download the self-assessment tool. Please monitor my site on Twitter. Access the government website, .gov.uk Surveillance Camera Commissioner. And thank you again.